that she was going to be joining within a few minutes, and that was around 8:50. So we still haven't heard from her. I don't see the judge here as well.
Yeah, he's not here either.
Those are the only.
Oh, there's an error. Can you please check the WhatsApp group?
Yep, looking right now. Is she joining? Do you know if, here, I'll ask her. She on, what phone are you on? Okay, she's on an Android. All right, let's see if I can get.
I actually had the same problem when I tried to join, and that I had to try a few times.
Interesting. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna try to send her a link again.
So we are trying to get in touch with the judge, and it looks as if he might be having connectivity issues.
Stacy, can you make me the host again, please?
Oh, right.
Vishwa, ignore that Slack I just sent you. I've got to get the link over to my cell phone. So
yeah,
that was the easiest way to do it.
Hi, Vinu.
Sorry, last minute I was like, I can't connect, but now it's fine. It's fine. How are you?
We're good. I'm good. Nice to hear you. You will turn on your webcam, right? When it's your turn, right? Can we just check the webcam? There you are. Lovely to see you.
Oh, yeah, she's on mute right now.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Hi, Stacy. Hi, Silvia.
Hi.
Okay, we're good. So we're just missing the judge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yep. All panelists, can you please put your cameras on currently right now? I just want to make sure that I can see all of you. Carola, got you. Fantastic. Rabbi, you're here as well. Reverend, fantastic. We're just missing Loreto and the judge.
Loreto, ¿puedes poner tu video, por favor?
Sí.
Gracias. Ahí estás. Here she is.
Fantastic. Just super quick before we get going. I know we're kind of still waiting on the judge here, but just some really quick Zoom best practice notes, even though I know a lot of you have done a bunch of these. We ask that everyone, when you're not speaking, just stay on mute, please. What that will do is that will help prevent if there happens to be any random background noise that goes on behind you. It'll stop for those people in the audience who have the speaker. It'll stop you from coming up as like the big screen in front of them. So just remain on mute during the presentation unless you're going to be speaking.
Loreto, la recomendación es mantener el micrófono en silencio cuando no estás hablando, ¿ya? Para evitar ruido de fondo.
Also, you guys will be in charge of muting and unmuting yourselves. We can mute you, but we cannot unmute you. That is like a feature in Zoom, so just keep that in mind. It's a good safety precaution that Zoom has as well. Another note is obviously we have interpretation on this, which is an awesome feature. But something that I want to reiterate is that when you are speaking, make sure that you have interpretation turned off on your end. So what you should see in that little icon or the icon above the word interpretation, you should just see a hollow globe there. When you are not speaking and if you would like to listen to interpretation, just go down, click on that button and choose the language that you would like. But once again, the key is make sure it is turned off when you are speaking. And the one last note I will say is that Bhavishva, our technical director, she is behind the scenes and she will be the one moving the slides. Just make sure that when you want her to go from one slide to the next, just let her know. You can just say next slide, please, or anything that can kind of cue her to move on. As people are speaking, she'll get used to your cadence pretty quickly, but that helps us make sure that we hit the mark as much as possible.
Loreto, cuando quieras que avance la diapositiva, porque hay una persona que la va a estar mostrando, ¿verdad? Entonces, si por favor, simplemente cuando quieras que avance, puedes decir next o no sé si para que esté pendiente. ¿Sí? No te escucho, estás en silencio ahora.
Sí, puedo decirle next, porque en
Next.
realidad la diapositiva me da la pauta para yo complementar lo que dice.
Exacto, entonces cuando quieres que avance, dices next. Ok.
Ya. Está
Okay.
bien, gracias. Next.
Okay. Great. And then the last thing I will say is if you guys see the chat function, there should be a tab and it will say all panelists. If you guys want to look there, I am in that chat and that's where I'm going to be doing the communication with all of you during the event. I will cue you when you are coming up next. I will let you know how much time you're spending and how much time you have left. And if you have any questions or concerns throughout the entire webinar, you just message right in there and I will get you an answer as best I can. So that's just the only other note that I have. I see that the judge just jumped in. So yeah, we can do an audio test with him. Oh, great. There you are. Your image looks awesome. Can we just get an audio test, please? You can say testing 1, 2, 3.
Hello, how are you, everyone?
Thank you. I think we're late. We should start.
Yeah, we should go ahead. We should go ahead and start. So, Vishal, let's have you broadcast, and then Silvia, whenever you're ready, once she broadcasts, you can start us.
Okay, broadcasting now.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar from all over the world. My name is Silvia Mazzarelli. I am the coordinator of the Global Network of Religions for Children in Latin America and the Caribbean, an initiative of Arigatou International, and co-chair of the Ending Violence Against Children Learning Hub of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. Welcome to the Joint Learning Initiative Ending Violence Against Children Learning Hub series. This is a 3-part series to discuss how faith partners can increase child participation to end violence and transform their communities. This series is co-hosted by JLI with the 4 co-chairs of the Learning Hub, of this Ending Violence Against Children Learning Hub, Arigatou International, Islamic Relief Worldwide, World Vision International, and Queen Margaret University. For those of you that don't know, the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities is an international collaboration focusing on evidence for full and appropriate faith actor engagement. If you want to learn more about the Joint Learning Initiative, you can access the website at jliflc.com. So this, as I mentioned, is a series of 3 webinars. The first session is right now focusing on how different faith actors and different faiths approach and understand child participation. We will have a second session in October that will focus on some initiatives that faith communities have undertaken to increase child participation. And then a final session, which will involve an intergenerational dialogue with children and adults from different faith communities. So let us look at the agenda very quickly. If we can move to the next slide. We will have some introductory remarks and initial findings on child participation from a scoping study that the Hub launched and developed last year and this will be presented by Carola Eyber. Then we will have a panel discussion with a multi-religious panel discussion with 5 distinguished guest speakers, and I will have the pleasure to moderate that panel, and I will introduce you to the speakers later on. And then we will have a Q&A session moderated by Stacy Nam from JLI, and then some closing remarks. And we will invite you to the next webinar in October. So quickly, a quick overview on the Hub. For those of you who are not familiar with the Hub, we can move to the next slide. So first of all, the Joint Learning Initiative, this is our vision. You can see it on the screen. What I would like to highlight here is that the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities has currently 5 active learning hubs. You will see them on the screen, and I'd like to highlight here that one of them is the Learning Hub on Ending Violence Against Children. We can move to the next. So the series of webinars, as I mentioned, here's a bit more on the Ending Violence Against Children Hub, which provides a unique platform for a global network of knowledge from academic, policymakers, and practitioners that are growing the evidence base of effective faith-based partnership to prevent and end violence against children. So as Hub partners, we are committed to convening an inclusive and diverse hub to advance a core set of values and principles to end violence against children. We are also committed to an evidence-based process focused on local faith communities and religious leaders, and to understanding how to engage and what works and does not work in order to provide practical recommendations for practitioners. So as I mentioned, the series of webinars is being organized as follow-up to a scoping study that was developed by the Ending Violence Against Children Hub last year in 2019. The scoping study was developed to better understand the role of religion and faith actors in protecting children against violence. And Dr. Carola Eyber, that is with us today, led the scoping study together with Dr. Selina Palm at Stellenbosch University, and under the guidance of Dr. Olivia Wilkinson from JLI. So you can access the 3-part scoping study report and also 2 briefs with the main findings on the website that I mentioned before, and I'm sure we will be able to put that on the chat box as well. So one of the thematic areas that the scoping study suggested to explore more in depth is child participation. So that is why we decided to organize this series of webinars to go deeper and explore more in depth this important topic of child participation. So I think we can move to the next slide. And it is now my pleasure And sorry for the background noise. There's a storm here in Panama City, in Panama, where I'm based. But let me introduce now Carola Eyber, who will speak about the evidence for this first part of our webinar. Dr. Carola Eyber holds a senior lectureship position at the Institute for Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. She's an experienced researcher on child protection issues with a particular interest in child resilience and local strategies for supporting children living in adversity. Recent research has focused on the role of local faith actors in child protection through influencing social norm change at community level. So Carola, it's over to you now for this first part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia, for the introduction. If we can have the next slide, please. I want to start with some observations coming from the studies and the research, as well as the scoping study around child participation and the potential it has as a means of ending violence and confronting violence against children. So the first observation I want to make is that children are often viewed as being different from adults. So we see adults as being active, being the perpetrators of violence, and children are contrasted to that. They are often seen as passive, as reactive, and in many senses incomplete. So childhood is seen as a period of development where they are becoming adults. The goal is to become an adult, so they are adults in the making. And this idea often carries over into how we understand children as innocent victims of adult perpetrated violence. And in many ways, that is what we want to understand, and we do see it like that because we fully recognize the distress and the impact that the violence has on all aspects of children's lives, and to understand the vulnerability that children have. But if we look at the continuum of vulnerability and resilience, what we find is that sometimes the pendulum swings very far towards the vulnerability side, and we ignore and we forget about the resilience that many children display. And when that happens, what it leads to, what it can lead to, is what researchers have called the rescue and rehabilitation approach. This phrase was first coined by Professor Joe Boyden in Oxford, who talked about the fact that often adults want to rush in and save children. They want to fix things. They want to make sure that children are safe, without actually listening to children's perspectives and listening to children's experiences of the particular situation that they are facing and their views on what they feel needs to be done. A further observation is around children's agencies and their contributions to household and communities. And in my research, I very often find myself in situations where children are engaged in childcare, they're engaged in household chores and tasks, and in income generation, in field work and herding and so on. But when you ask the adults in the households, how are children contributing, they will often say, oh, they do nothing. They are not capable yet of contributing anything to the household. So children's agency and their contributions often become invisible. So they are not easily seen by us as adults because we only recognize, or we may recognize and expect certain contributions. Underlying all of that is an issue around the status of children within our communities and within our faith communities. So often what happens is that children are seen as somewhat less. They are less than others within the communities. And within a hierarchy, what we may find is that we see older men, perhaps at the top of that hierarchy, and children right at the bottom of the hierarchy. And this has moral and legal and ethical implications for how we understand and work with children within our contexts. If I may have the next slide, please. I briefly want to make some observations coming out of the scoping study in terms of how our understanding of child participation can help. And one of those is that the key faith child protection experts that we interviewed for the scoping study and the literature suggests that child-centered approaches that link protection and participation can play a very powerful role in strengthening children's agency and recognizing, so making more visible the contributions, the resilience, and the particular actions that children take within the particular settings that they have. Underlying that is a child rights and child empowerment approach. And this is really in recognition that child rights, of course, are human rights. And I believe that Arigatou International produced a very comprehensive study on the issue of child rights last year from a faith perspective, and looking at their participation and the ability to express their opinions in a variety of contexts. And we understand that those contexts have their own particular socio-cultural perspectives on adult-child relationships and hierarchies and so on, but are important. We also then begin to recognize children as active contributors to their religious communities and provide more opportunities for that, as well as nurturing the child resilience that children have as active survivors. And several case studies pointed to the fact that children can act as partners and peer supporters to one another for children who are and have experienced violence. But underlying that is the changing mindset of adults within faith communities, which is vital. So, you know, if we emphasize what children should do and how they should participate and so on, without looking at the mindsets of adults within those communities, it is not a complete picture. This is a crucial component in how we approach that. And then my final point, really coming out of the scoping study, is the importance of fostering open intergenerational dialogue within families and religious spaces. And this, in fact, becomes the topic of our third webinar, which we will come back to again at the end of today's session. But these are just some very brief observational points in regard to that. And now I want to pass back to Silvia to introduce the rest of our esteemed panel and speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carola, and thank you for this good presentation that sort of sets the stage for the next part of the program. Again, we would like to invite you to look at the scoping study. Stacy just put the link on the chat. Please have a look at it, and you will find much more in it. So let's move now to the multi-religious panel that I have the pleasure and honor to moderate today with our distinguished speakers. The panel is, as I mentioned, will take us through child participation as it is viewed in the following faith traditions: the Bahá'í faith, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. So we would also like to hear from our panelists why child participation is important from a faith perspective, and particularly to contribute to end violence against children. So the first speaker I have the pleasure to introduce is Judge Mohamad Abu Zaid from Lebanon. Judge Abu Zaid is a senior judge in the family court of Saida in Lebanon. He is also lecturer in contemporary Islamic thoughts, comparative religions, personal status laws, procedures of lawsuit in Islamic courts at Jinan University since 2007. He has published 18 books and many studies and researches in Arabic related to issues of jihad and Islamic extremism, peace building and reconciliation from an Islamic perspective, contemporary Islamic thought, law, and Islamic Christian dialogue. So I would like to remind all our speakers today that we have 5-7 minutes each to share with us a few thoughts. So Sheikh, now the floor is yours. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to this meeting. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to prepare myself. I came directly from the court. I was at the court today, directly from the court to catch this meeting. And during this day, I was doing in a practical way the things that I will talk about now. Then listening to children. As you mentioned, I'm the senior judge in a family court. Then we deal with everything related to family. And sure, children are a focal person in every family. And in my court, I receive many, many cases. I think more than 60 to 70 cases are related directly or indirectly to children. Then, as a religious leader in my community, as a Muslim imam, as a judge in a family court, how can I think about the issue of engaging children, listening to children, and trying to make them part of any decision that me as a judge I will take at the end of the day. You need to know something about our Islamic mentality. We usually refer to Prophet Muhammad, and Prophet Muhammad was a husband, was a father, was a grandfather, beside being a prophet and being the head of the state. We refer to his biography, we see how he was dealing with his children as a father, how he was dealing with his grandchildren and with the children of other Muslims as a head of the Islamic community. And we can take inspiration from his acts, we can take inspiration from his talk, from the situations he went through, to see how he was doing that thing from a religious, from the perspective of a highest religious authority in the Muslim community towards the children. And you mentioned, or someone mentioned, that children are in the lower base of the hierarchy. Then this is the idea, how the head of the Islamic community is dealing with children whom we think about that they are below us. We have a lot of stories, and I will highlight one of these stories. When an infant, when a juvenile was crying, and the Prophet realized that this juvenile was crying, and he simply started to speak with him. And now we can think about the words the Prophet was using. It is not the strong, complicated terminology. No, he was speaking in a very friendly way with the child, with a very kind way with the child. And even he did not give the child his name. He started to give some light titles and to make the child feel comfortable. And then he asked him about the reason why he is crying, and he tried to comfort him. Then the idea is the head of the Muslim community is speaking to a child and caring for a child and trying to listen and knowing what was the matter with this child and trying to comfort this child. Then again, me as a judge in a family court, as an imam in one of the biggest mosques here in Lebanon, I take inspiration from how the Prophet acted. Yes, I have some senior position in my community, but still I'm a father, still I'm a grandfather, still I'm a human being, and I should care for everyone. And children are part of the community that we should care and be concerned with. Then, as a judge in my court, when I have any struggle between the wife and the husband, and there are children between them, I'll try my best to invite children, not to the public session, to a private session, and I ask them, what do you think about the life of your parents? And where do you think that you are more fitting? And are you having some hard time with your mother or with your father? Are they treating you well? Listening to the child knowing some background about his psychological situation, about his spirit, about how he feels about his family, can help me as a judge. Though I have my own experience and my own training and my own academic degree, but still listening to a child can give me a lot of help in giving the final rule and taking the needed decision to protect the family in general, and especially and specifically the judge. Then in brief, as a Muslim imam, as a Muslim judge, I take inspiration from the acts of my Prophet Muhammad as a prophet, as a religious leader, but also as the father and the grandfather. And I take this inspiration to put it in a practical way to inspire me and to use it in my daily work in a court or in a mosque. But now we can think about the hard thing. Are all imams having this training? Are all imams using this methodology? Are all imams able to speak to children? Do they have the technique? Do they have the capabilities? I think no. That's why with the help of Islamic Relief here in Lebanon, with the help of other organizations, and recently we had some training and some cooperation with Arigatou International here in Beirut, in Lebanon, we are doing some programs for other imams to have this kind of training, to be more aware about children and more able to speak and listen to children and to know what is harming these children, to act as religious leaders, to stop violence, to end violence, to protect children and to secure children. Maybe in brief, this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Judge. Very interesting, especially considering the very practical experience that you are sharing with us today, and this strong recommendation at the end of your presentation on the importance of training imams, right? So we will have time also for some questions later on. So we encourage all the attendees to ask questions. There's a Q&A button you can click on and ask questions. We'll have people looking at that chat box for the final session, the Q&A session. So we will move now to, thanks again, Imam, Sheikh, and we will now move to our next panelist, and I will introduce to her in Spanish. She is from Chile. Es un gran gusto para mí entonces presentarles a la profesora María Loreto Jara Barrera. Es coordinadora del programa de desarrollo espiritual para niños de la comunidad Bahá'í en Santiago de Chile, en Chile. Es también profesora de Estado en Educación General Básica de la Universidad de Chile, en Santiago, con estudios de posgrado en Desarrollo Socioeconómico en Lima, Perú. Cuenta con un posgrado en Convivencia y Orientación Escolar por la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, y ha trabajado como maestra de aula en contextos bilingües en la zona mapuche y como maestra en Escuela de Educación Especial en Temuco, Chile. También como docente de educación superior en Lima, Perú. Actualmente se desempeña como orientadora y encargada de convivencia escolar en la Escuela Bélgica, ubicada en un sector vulnerable de Santiago de Chile. Profesora Jara tiene 5 o 7 minutos para compartir con nosotros algunas ideas desde su tradición religiosa, desde la fe Bahá'í, sobre la participación de los niños, niñas y adolescentes. Adelante.
Muchas gracias, Silvia, por la presentación y por la invitación. Entonces, trataremos en estos minutos de poder compartir la perspectiva Bahá'í sobre la educación y sobre la participación de la niñez. The next, por favor. Voy a abordar el tema en 3 aspectos: niño, familia y educación, que se interrelacionan, cómo estos 3 aspectos facilitan la participación y expresión de los niños. Next. Entenderemos por niño a toda persona que se encuentra en los primeros años de la vida, en una etapa en la cual está desarrollando sus capacidades, por lo que necesita una mayor atención, cuidados y protección, y así pueda prepararse para una vida plena e independiente. Nosotros sabemos que la realidad del hombre incluye tres aspectos: el físico, intelectual y espiritual. Al momento de nacer, todos estos aspectos existen en potencia. Desde el comienzo hasta el término de su vida, el ser humano atraviesa periodos o etapas, cada una enmarcada por ciertas condiciones que le son características. Durante el periodo de la niñez, las facultades internas de los niños, incluyendo sus pensamientos, fantasías, el alcance de su imaginación, sus sentimientos, sus estructuras y su razonamiento, incluso su risa, su llanto, son formas de expresión y hay formas de relacionarse con otros. Todo esto va evolucionando a medida que va pasando de una etapa a otra. Los niños pequeños tienen sentimientos y emociones, poseen la capacidad del pensamiento y la capacidad intelectual. La diferencia es que estas facultades se encuentran en sus etapas iniciales de crecimiento. Pensar que porque son pequeños no tienen derecho a ser escuchados es un gran error. El trato hacia él debe ser digno y respetuoso, y en este marco orientar su comportamiento. The next. Independientemente de la etapa de desarrollo en que se encuentra el niño, siempre debemos de tener un trato de respeto hacia su dignidad y nobleza con la que el Creador le dotó. En los escritos leemos: oh Hijo del Espíritu, te he creado noble, elévate pues a la altura de aquello para lo cual fuiste creado. Vamos a pasar a la próxima, tiene que ver con la familia. The next. La familia es una institución fundamental de la civilización humana. Es el primer medio ambiente del niño dentro del cual comienza a construir las estructuras morales y a formar patrones esenciales de comportamiento. La familia, como grupo fundamental de la sociedad, brinda un espacio de crecimiento y bienestar para todos sus miembros, especialmente para los niños. El niño debe crecer en el seno de una familia que le permita el desarrollo armonioso de la personalidad, de su espíritu y de su salud mental y física. Como decíamos, los niños pequeños tienen sentimientos, tienen emociones, poseen la capacidad del pensamiento, la capacidad intelectual. La diferencia con el adulto es que se encuentran en la etapa inicial de crecimiento. Pensar que porque son pequeños no tienen derecho a ser escuchados, eso es un error. El trato hacia él debe ser digno y respetuoso. The next. Ahora, la educación, vamos a entender por educación como un proceso continuo y creativo. Su propósito es desarrollar capacidades latentes del ser humano y promover el desarrollo personal para la transformación social. Es a través de la educación que podemos desarrollar las potencialidades del niño, tanto intelectuales como físicas y espirituales, promoviendo su bienestar y el principio de participación y el derecho a ser escuchado. Cuando la educación ayuda a cada niño a desarrollar sus propias potencialidades y a la vez crea en él la conciencia de que debe utilizarlas para contribuir a una civilización en progreso continuo y a la creación de una sociedad caracterizada por la unidad, justicia, la paz, entonces estará cumpliendo su función. Me gustaría hacer una mención especial sobre la importancia de la educación espiritual como complemento a la educación intelectual y física. El desarrollo de las cualidades espirituales como el amor por la justicia, el respeto y el cuidado de los recursos naturales del planeta, la solidaridad y la veracidad, por nombrar algunos, permiten al niño ir enfocando sus capacidades en el bienestar de todos. Leemos una cita de los escritos Bahá'ís: el hombre es el talismán supremo. Sin embargo, la falta de una educación adecuada le ha privado de aquello que inherentemente posee. Considerad al hombre como una mina rica en gemas de valor inestimable. Solamente la educación puede hacerle revelar sus tesoros y permitir a la humanidad beneficiarse. Cuando la educación en realidad está desarrollando esa parte espiritual, esas cualidades que son tan propias del ser humano, de la parte espiritual, está cumpliendo la función que debe tener. En la comunidad Bahá'í contamos con un programa de educación espiritual que está dirigido a los niños. Tienen metodologías apropiadas a su edad y en este programa se motiva la participación de las familias, ya que es un elemento importante de este programa. El elemento del juego, de las narraciones, de las canciones y la participación de las familias. Este programa de educación está abierto a toda la comunidad, ¿ya? No es necesario pertenecer a la comunidad Bahá'í para poder participar del programa de educación espiritual para los niños. En Santiago, en este momento que estamos viviendo de pandemia, estas clases, este programa se está desarrollando en forma virtual, en forma ya sea a través de plataformas virtuales, a través de WhatsApp, pero continuamos los vínculos con los niños y con los padres. Podríamos concluir que desde la perspectiva Bahá'í hay ciertos temas muy claros. El ser humano es esencialmente noble y nace con infinitas potencialidades. Otra conclusión: la realidad del hombre incluye 3 aspectos: físico, intelectual y espiritual. Al momento de nacer, todos estos aspectos existen en potencia. Independientemente de la etapa de desarrollo en que se encuentre el niño, siempre debemos de tener un trato de respeto hacia su dignidad y nobleza. Los niños tienen derecho a participar y expresar su opinión de diversas maneras y en diversos espacios. La espiritualidad es inherente al ser humano. La educación espiritual es fundamental para garantizar las capacidades que sean puestas al servicio de la sociedad. Y por último, la familia es una institución fundamental de la civilización humana. Es el primer medio ambiente del niño. The next. Quisiera terminar con una reflexión. Los niños son el tesoro más preciado que puede poseer una comunidad, pues en ellos reside la promesa y garantía del futuro. Nosotros como comunidades de fe podemos pensar, analizar cómo estamos cuidando este tesoro tan preciado en nuestras instituciones de fe, qué oportunidades de expresión les estamos dando, qué derechos les estamos respetando. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, profesora. Muy clara su presentación, que nos recuerda además que el desarrollo del niño debe ser un desarrollo integral en todas sus dimensiones y por esto la importancia de la educación espiritual, ¿no? Así que con esta pregunta con la que usted terminó, podemos pasar a la siguiente presentación. It is my pleasure now to move to the next speaker. Just a clarification: the chat is disabled for attendees, but please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A chat that is there. So we will be able to and look at those questions and send them to the panelists. So my pleasure now is to introduce to you Dr. Kezevino Adam from India. Dr. Aram is a global leader of interreligious efforts to build peace. She is also a leading public health thinker and advocate. She is currently the president of a dedicated Gandhian institution called Shanti Ashram, and also the founder of the International Center for Child and Public Health. She is a child health practitioner by training, completed her undergraduate studies at the PSG Institute of Medical Sciences and postgraduate studies from the Harvard School of Public Health. She is also the co-moderator and executive committee member of Religions for Peace International and the vice chairperson of the advisory group of Arigatou International. She has collaborated with many institutions at all levels, globally, regionally, including governments, multilateral institutions, economic institutions, and interfaith organizations. So Vinu, as we call you, the floor is yours for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Silvia. It's a real honor to be with everybody on this important day. 30 years ago, the World Summit for Children was held, and what a wonderful way to celebrate the anniversary, the 30th anniversary, by being together. But I must also remind us of the times that we are part of, again, unprecedented, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think the positive drawing of history and the immediate challenges that our children face have made this sharing that much more special. When Maria Lucia wrote to me to speak about child participation, I said yes, because throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, I have thought so deeply about what this means, how to live in the midst of the pandemic, working with children actively. So please allow me to express my deep gratitude for this historic occasion and the opportunity to think together. May I ask for the slides now? You know, we would have never imagined that this would be a way in which we would seek the participation of children, where us standing separate. We were always used to asking them, come together, do something together. But in the midst of the pandemic, this image also stays with me. This image is from Shanti Ashram, where young people from different religious communities together learned how to physically distance and to help their families. Next slide, please. This image is also something that our children in India have been a witness to. The oceans of migrant workers who rose to the public consciousness. And suddenly in the image of the other, our children saw themselves. They saw the vulnerability that the migrant workers were carrying from one part of the India to another, but they also saw the humanity that came across from ordinary people across the country where ethics was lived. And so I think these two images spoke to me deeply during this pandemic, and I want to put this as a background while I speak of child participation. Next slide, please. All of us don't have to be reminded as to what child participation is, but we all know it's more than having a voice. It's about being informed, it's about being engaged, it's about having a real influence in decisions and matters that affects one's life. When Carola was speaking about agency, when Carola was speaking to us also about the pendulum swinging between vulnerability and resilience, I was reminded about how adults have to prepare in order that we may seek with respect, with understanding, the participation of children. Next slide, please. And this is where my thought is centered around. Next slide, please. I was going through a series of papers that Maria Lucia and Ms. Ornella very kindly sent me to read. I had asked for this indulgence, And this last 2 weeks has been wonderful for me to read many, many, many papers in preparation. This is one box that came out of the UNICEF document where we are urging people to look at ways of enabling child participation. And when I went through this table in the middle of in the handbook, I saw we at Shanti Ashram, we work with about 70,000 children a year. We were doing almost all of those bullet points, those boxes could be ticked. But when I booklet and I reflected that evening, something else struck me. And this is where the Hindu perspective will come in my presentation. Next slide, please. What struck me was a lot of it was centered around the love for a child, for the doing, what they do and what they can do. And in the quiet reflection that I had, I was reminded of the values that the Hindu tradition teach me, that it is not enough only to value a person for their doing, what they can do. But it's also important to remember that the child in herself or in himself has an intrinsic value in our community. So this is something that I want to bring to the table to this multi-religious conversation as to how do we look at a child, how do we visualize child participation and find the balance between the love for the doing and the love for the being, because the child is an immediate reminder that the child has a value in herself, not waiting for adulthood, but an intrinsic value as a child. Next slide. And this is where two things, I've read quite a bit, and it's been a joy reflecting over what my tradition speaks on participation in general, but also in the participation of children and young people. And two things spoke to me. One is the principle of Dharma. Swami Dayananda Saraswati, a very well-known acharya from the Arsha Vidya Kulukram, speaks about Dharma as a Sanskrit word that is equivalent of values, of ethical values. But ethical values is not just to be mentioned, but it has to be lived in conduct. In fact, Swami Dayananda Saraswati goes on to speak that Dharma is that value set which you would like others to adopt, to treat or interact with you. So individually, a child is often introduced to Dharma. And this introduction becomes, I think, even deeper and is reinforced multiple times when they participate in something they can contribute to the common good. And closely linked to Dharma is another concept or understanding in the Hindu tradition, which is Atma Jnana. Atma or Adhyatma Jnana means it is in some ways the awareness of the self. And this is a prerequisite. The young child is directed, is guided, is allowed the freedom to be self-reflective, to be aware of who he or she is. And in this space, I think, when these two principles in some ways play out, the individual child somewhere starts honoring himself or herself. The love of the being, the love for the being of the child becomes alive. So these two principles spoke to me, and I bring this as a gift from my tradition to the conversation here this afternoon. Dharma, or the equivalent of values, ethical values, which is something that you would like others to adopt, to work with you. But of course, then you must adopt to interact with others. And Atma Jnana, the self-awareness or the self-knowledge as a prerequisite to growth, to progress, and to the development of a child. Next slide, please. So if this is looked at the individual level, what then are some values or some practices or some ideas from the Hindu tradition that influences collectively children? And there are two things that spoke to me, and it has spoken to me throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. With my colleagues at Shanti Ashram, many evenings I have sat down and said, how did this happen? And I was reminded again when Carola was speaking about one instance where we had an interactive session on transformational leadership, and the panel had a 7-year-old and an 84-year-old there. And at the end of the presentation, the moderator said, anyone who has questions, please ask. And the child was so neutral, coming from a family or a community where hierarchy of age is so strong. Suddenly, this young child felt the liberty or the democratic opportunity to ask anybody. I know I have a few minutes, so let me just introduce these two ideas. The idea of satsang, or the company of the enlightened, the right-minded, or the fellow seeker to become what we want to be. So the love for the being, the love for the becoming, and the love for the doing. Sanmarga, again, is an idea from the Hindu tradition, which is sharing with children, pointing to children, discovering with children the virtuous path to becoming. Next slide, please. And this is where I think when children and adults work together, there is more that we can discover in terms of child participation. So it's not just engaging children, but it is working together with children. Next slide. And this, I think I will keep the stories for the later, but a 7-year-old who during COVID-19 walked up to me and we had a conversation about where the mind is. Just a demonstration as equal partners, we help each other to think beyond the normal frontiers. Next slide, please. You know, this again is from one of the materials that I read as background. I think it's either from the Joint Learning Initiative or from the Inter-UN report about different ways to ensure child participation. All that you see in the gray circles is what is looked at as possible ways. I have pulled out two because during this pandemic and throughout my 20-year career, I feel before we set off to engage children, adults have to prepare. Adults have to unlearn. Adults have to form themselves again so that it is an equal relationship. It is a relationship where we value the child for the being and the doing, but we also value child participation as a collective effort to achieve the common good. And my final slide would be a thought that I would like you to take away. I will move to the next slide. And that's the thought that I'd like you to take away at the end of my presentation, is when adults and children prepare themselves, when child participation becomes part of our work, not only is the agency of the child made visible, not only is the empowerment of the child a real possibility, but together we share something that Mahatma Gandhi said, true happiness in that collective work, in that process that we set off for ourselves to overcome some of the biggest challenges that humanity faces. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Adam. And it's such a pity we don't have more time to share all your knowledge and expertise with us. We're learning so much from this multi-religious panel. But thank you for bringing the idea and these two key principles that are at the core of your faith tradition that help us see the child's intrinsic value. I also very much like this idea of these two levels, the individual level and the collective level, and of course also the reminding us the additional challenges that the COVID-19 has brought and how this is affecting child participation even more at all levels. Now we will move to our next speaker y voy a presentarle en español. El rabino Gustavo Kraselnik de Panamá. Es el líder espiritual de la congregación Kol Sharit Israel de Panamá desde el año 2002 y es el representante de la comunidad judía panameña en el Comité Interreligioso de Panamá. El rabino fue ordenado rabino por el Seminario Rabínico Latinoamericano en 1996 y se desempeñó como rabino de la comunidad israelita de El Salvador desde 1996 hasta 2002. Actualmente es el representante del Congreso Judío Latinoamericano para el Diálogo Interreligioso en Centroamérica y el Caribe y ha participado en múltiples foros interreligiosos en todas las regiones. Es de origen argentino, está casado, tiene un hijo y tiene mucho que compartir con nosotros el día de hoy. Así que sin más, le paso la palabra a usted, rabino. Adelante.
Buenos días aquí en Panamá. Buenas tardes en otras latitudes. Gracias, Silvia, por presentación, por la introducción y por la invitación. Es un verdadero honor estar aquí esta mañana y escuchar también las distintas reflexiones que comparten aquí mis colegas en el panel. en este enfoque multireligioso y también de perspectivas diferentes. Yo me voy a enfocar desde la tradición judía en algo un poco más personal y más íntimo, que tiene que ver con la celebración del ritual de la Pascua. Pero permítanme comenzar entendiendo la importancia de dar voz a la niñez y fomentar su participación, entendiendo que la tradición se transmite, y esto es una conexión lingüística. La palabra tradición y transmisión están conectadas en hebreo y también en los idiomas latinos, no solo conceptual, sino etimológicamente. Y esto es porque en el acto de transmitir es como se forja la tradición, pero no es una transmisión unívoca, sino que es fruto de un diálogo que se da de manera intergeneracional. Y así hemos llevado la tradición a lo largo de los siglos en este diálogo de padres a hijos, de hijos a padres, que permite entonces también una adaptación, un ayornamiento que la vuelve relevante también para nuestros días. Tenemos una tradición de 2500, 3000 años que va manteniéndose vigente a partir de ese diálogo. La tradición judía ofrece muchos espacios para llevar adelante esta experiencia de transmisión y tradición, pero yo quería enfocarme en el ritual posiblemente más importante que tiene el judaísmo en cuanto a la experiencia hogareña, que es la celebración de la Pascua en el hogar. La Pascua es posiblemente la fiesta más importante del año, celebra la liberación de los esclavos israelitas en el desierto, como relata la Biblia, nuestro libro sagrado. Y si bien en su origen, como toda la experiencia antigua, era una celebración cultica limitada al espacio sagrado, desde hace 2000 años y por la destrucción del templo de Jerusalén, entre otras cosas, se trasladó al seno del hogar. Entonces, el ritual principal de esta fiesta es el Seder, una cena ceremonial que se realiza las primeras 2 noches y que incluye la narración del relato del Éxodo, así como también degustar determinados alimentos fuertemente cargados de simbolismo. Por ejemplo, se comen hierbas amargas que nos recuerdan el sufrimiento de los esclavos, el jaroset, que es una mezcla color marrón, chocolate, que evoca el cemento con el que los israelitas construyeron las pirámides de Egipto. Esta noche del Seder es el acontecimiento fundacional más importante del pueblo judío y se da en el seno de la familia. Hay un protocolo que se establece, hay un libro que se llama la Agadá que nos va guiando. Y en ese protocolo uno de los momentos más valiosos es cuando los niños pequeños preguntan, Manishtaná, ¿por qué esta noche es diferente a todas las demás? Uno cuando va creciendo empieza a imaginar ese momento que lo vivió de niño, cómo va a ser cuando su hijo o su hija llegue a poder preguntar. Y todo papá, toda mamá atesora como uno de los momentos más valiosos ese instante cuando su hijo ya está capacitado para preguntar. Porque la idea de la pregunta es que los niños tienen este rol cuestionador. Y todo el ambiente potencia esta idea de recordarle que tiene que preguntar y ver la diferencia de esta noche, ¿no? Y los padres responden a esta pregunta hablándole de las diferencias, de los alimentos y de lo que estamos celebrando. El Seder es la respuesta a lo que dice el texto bíblico. Le contarás a tu hijo en aquel día diciendo, esto es por lo que Dios hizo por mí cuando salí de Egipto. Y eso lo venimos haciendo generación tras generación, como este diálogo, este espacio de interacción en el cual los niños son los verdaderos protagonistas. El despliegue de comidas especiales, el ambiente en general nos lleva a percibir que esa noche de celebración es una noche diferente. Y todo el ceremonial tiene recursos pedagógicos, juegos, canciones, rituales, que apunta a invitarlos a un ejercicio espontáneo de cuestionamiento, en donde ese diálogo, esas respuestas que escuchan dan lugar a nuevas preguntas y lo nutren de tradición e identidad. Porque en esencia el Seder, esta cena ceremonial de la Pascua, es un espacio de encuentro intergeneracional en donde el objetivo no es solamente recordar el pasado, sino también revivir la experiencia de la esclavitud y de la redención, en donde cada participante, adulto o niño, es protagonista. Y por supuesto que también esto es una invitación a reflexionar sobre el significado de la esclavitud y de la libertad para nuestro tiempo, que quizás tiene otras formas la esclavitud, pero de muchas maneras se siguen manifestando. Pues el Talmud, que es el libro de sabiduría judía posterior a la Biblia, dice que a cada niño hay que enseñarle según su capacidad de comprensión. Y esto nos recuerda tener presente la diversidad de cada uno de los niños y las niñas en cuanto a sus habilidades, en cuanto a su capacidad cognitiva, y tener la posibilidad de adecuar nuestro lenguaje para que la comprensión sea la apropiada, porque insisto, en este diálogo que se repite a lo largo de los siglos, de manera general, y en el seno de cada hogar, de manera íntima, individual, es donde se forja, se va construyendo la identidad judía de las próximas generaciones, para que puedan enriquecerse en este encuentro permanente y escuchar y hacerse escuchar en el diálogo constante, que es la garantía que nos permite seguir manteniendo la riqueza de nuestra tradición. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Rabino, muy interesante. Además, eso del diálogo intergeneracional justo es uno de los hallazgos del estudio exploratorio que realizamos y al que nos referimos al comenzar ese webinar y al que presentó Carola Eyber. Interesante entonces ese diálogo y encuentro intergeneracional y el ritual de la Pascua como oportunidad, ¿verdad? Para fortalecer la participación de los niños, niñas y adolescentes en el seno familiar, además, ¿no? También interesante recordar el desarrollo progresivo, ¿no? del niño, niña y adolescente y las distintas etapas de su desarrollo. Muy interesante, muchas gracias y seguramente surgirán preguntas. Les invitamos nuevamente a escribir y hacer sus preguntas haciendo clic en la parte correspondiente que ven en su pantalla. Pasamos entonces al último panelista. I'm going back to English, switching back to English. I have the great pleasure to introduce, last but not least, my colleague, Reverend Fred Nyabera. Reverend Fred Nyabera is the director of the Interfaith Initiative to End Child Poverty at Arigatou International. He is a social scientist and a trained theologian with interest in development work. Previously, he served as pastor at the Nairobi Baptist Church and Karen Community Church. He also served as the executive director of the Fellowship of Christian Councils and Churches in the Great Lakes and Horn of Africa, which is a regional peace-building NGO with membership in 10 countries in the region. He is the recipient of the 2019 Spirit of the United Nations. It is an award presented to members of the UN community, including ambassadors, UN staff, NGOs, and youth representatives for upholding the founding spirit of the United Nations. So Fred, it's over to you now with the final ideas and reflections from the Christian tradition. Thank you, Fred.
Let me start by thanking all of you, fellow panelists. It's been very stimulating to listen to all of you. And this is one of the advantages of coming last. And I also want to thank the organizers of this webinar. It's good to see Stacy, Vino, Silvia, some of the usual faces that we normally work with in this work of holding the well-being of children. I'm going to give some reflections on the Christian perspective of child's participation. And from the beginning, let me just confess and say that there's always a disconnect between what I call orthodoxy and orthopraxy. That means the belief and the teaching of any faith like Christianity and the actual practice. But I'm going to focus more on what I call orthodoxy, some of the teachings we find, especially in the biblical text. I don't know whether the PowerPoint is on. Is somebody helping me with that? Yes. And within this, I want us to look at the biblical characterization of the child, and I'll only talk about 3. There are many. And also, I'll talk about how the Bible sees child's participation, and I'll give about 4 examples. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, the Bible, which is the primary and authoritative Christian text, characterizes children, first of all, as a person with inherent dignity and worth. It refers to the child, just like all men and women, as created in the image of God. And I think that's what Venus said when she talked about the intrinsic value, the inherent value that children have. So that in itself is a principle that we must uphold when we are interacting with the children. And then secondly, the Bible sees the child as a complete whole person in their own right, holding special status among God's creation. And that again goes back to what Carol said. The children are not just little people with potential, but the Bible sees them as people with their own rights, created in the innermost. By creation, God had already identified them and knew them by the name, as the Bible says. And then thirdly, the third characterization that we find here is the child is actually characterized as a model to emulate, as an example. And there's this story, very interesting story in Matthew chapter 18, whereby the disciples are arguing on who is the greatest among them. And then Jesus does something very credible. He looks around and there's a child in the crowd, child's participation, and he takes this child and puts the child at the center physically. And then he tells the disciples that unless you become like a child, you shall not enter the kingdom of God. Or for you to enter the kingdom of God, you must become like a child. The interesting thing is that Jesus comes up with a different narrative from a very intense and central debate about the kingdom. The kingdom of God in Christian tradition is a big one. And that was the debate that was going on. And Jesus brings the child, he turns the tables, and then points at the child and says that this is the example of whoever will be in the kingdom of God. And in a sense, Jesus is saying, the child is central, the child has inherent value, and you must be, and this is an example. Next slide. Another one, let's talk about the children's capacity to participate. And the next slide talks about mainly 4 areas that I want to highlight. May we have, yeah. One is, again, an example of Jesus. The Bible portrays children as full members of community in their own right. First, we see that children were present in the public life of Jesus. Another interesting example is Jesus' teaching, and then children are brought so that they may be blessed. And the typical adult's way of acting, the disciples, the inner core of the faith, are saying, let them go, take them away from here. They're making noise. But then Jesus said this, let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as this. Present within the community and the participating within the teachings of Jesus. Secondly, we see the children partake alongside adults in the religious life of community. In Joshua, we are told that there was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel. including women and children and foreigners who lived among them. There's another example again, Jesus is teaching in the temple, and then the children are shouting and singing his praises, saying that Hosanna, the kingdom of God. And the disciples are telling, the chief priests and the teachers of the law are telling them to keep quiet. And Jesus says, no, let the children be. In fact, Jeremiah stretches this narrative and equates the lack of or absence of children in public life as a key indicator of poor health of the community and society. In the words of Jeremiah, he writes and says, death has climbed in through our windows and entered our fortress. It has removed the children from the streets and the young men from the public squares. COVID, Vino was talking about COVID. There are sense in which COVID has removed the children from the streets. And that is the equation that Jeremiah equates the health of the public and society with the presence or absence of children. And then lastly, the children are also presented as type of leadership to come, where the kingdom of God in its fullness is being envisioned, when the wolf will live with the lamb will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearlings together, and the little children will lead them, a symbol of leadership with a solution. Can we have the next slide? Now, viewing children from the perspective of made in God's image should shape our views of children and enhance their role and capacity. What we are seeing here is that though the ethical faculty of children is still under development and they need family, community, and state protection and nurture, the child is created in the image of God, as we've said, and therefore is pre-known, and the Bible portrays the child as full member to participate in the community in their own right. But as Vino has said, it would seem that the model set up in the scripture is not only to listen to the children, but recognize and affirm their own intervention. And to do this, it is the adults that need to embrace and be emancipated from his view of the child, and then recognize, affirm that a child and children have a voice, they have something to say, they are competent to carry it, and what they say is important and constructive to the public engagement. And in fact, God is not limited to working with the adults only. When the Christian Savior Jesus Christ had to come, he came as a child. So there's a need for us to affirm that, but not only by belief, but also by practice, but also change our way of thinking, come up with a different narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Nyabera. Very interesting, and reminding us the role of the adult, and also that this is theory and now we have to move to practice, which is exactly what we will be looking at in the next webinar. It has been very interesting to listen to different perspectives from the different faith traditions today. I don't want to take much time to summarize what we've heard, but because I want to have the time for Stacy to lead us to the next session, which is the Q&A session. I'm sure there are some more, so that we have more opportunity to listen to our speakers. I just want one final note. I just would like you to, I would just want to share with you all that last year, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Arigatou International, together with several partners, including some of the co-chairs of this Ending Violence Against Children Hub of JLI, developed and launched an interesting multi-religious study called Faith and Children's Rights, which looks at the Convention on the Rights of the Child from 7 different religious traditions and perspectives. And why am I sharing this? Because there's a whole section on the principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the commonalities between the religious values of these 7 religions and the CRC's principles. So I think that could be interesting. Also, it complements and several of the religious leaders that have been with us today also contributed to that, those reflections that led us to publishing the study. So I will put on the chat box the link so that you can all access that study. And if you would like to read more on child participation, there's a whole section on that. So thank you again to our distinguished speakers. Muchas gracias por este excelente panel. Y pasamos a las preguntas, a la sesión de preguntas. Stacy, now it's over to you for the Q&A session and the final part of the program for today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again to all of the panelists. We do have a few questions, but before I get to that, for anyone who has their hands up, if you have a question, if you can click on the button at the bottom that says Q&A, then we will be able to answer those. If you have a technical issue with Zoom, you can also put that in the Q&A and someone can help you. So the first question we have is from Eleonora. This is for all of the panelists. So as Vinu reminded us, it is important for the adults in whatever function, parents, teachers, imams, educators, and facilitators to unlearn and relearn about childhood in order to move from seeing only vulnerabilities in adulthood in the making to understanding the resilience and the agency of the child. What suggestions and learnings can you share with us about these unlearning and relearning processes? What are the success stories, but also the challenges? And if you want to unmute yourself, if you have...
Can I take it, Stacy? Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. I'll only take a few seconds, but I want to point to the framework of unlearning. You know, just like we create safe spaces for children so that they can ask questions, they can present their problems and challenges, I think we have to create safe spaces for adults to unlearn as well. During the COVID-19 pandemic at the ashram, very early on, you know, this was completely unprecedented. We wanted to know how to assist children. And we had interns on campus that's one of the concrete things that we started to engage children. And we gave them a day and we said, we want to hear you. And they came out so creatively, but so realistically as to what they needed. But also for us adults, I think that is the responsibility of families, of religious communities, of organizations, that when we you know, because we're all shaped by how we are raised, what we study, if we want to unlearn, I think one of the ways is to listen to children. The other, be able as adults to have the safe space to say, this might work better, that might work better. You know, let's hear each other. So I actually emphasize a lot on adult preparation. The success story for me immediately has been the COVID-19 pandemic. The entire after-school program and the hybrid capacity building program at Shanti Ashram was done in partnership with young people. My colleague Vijay is writing about it, but that has been a success story. Thank you, Stacy. So safe spaces for adults as well, just like children, to unlearn.
Great, thanks, Vinu.
Let me just jump in very briefly. I believe that stereotypes and beliefs are learned and they can be unlearned, but because of the cultural practices and traditions, it becomes very difficult sometimes. But one way, if there are people of faith, is to go to the truth itself. There are some silent texts that speaks otherwise, like some of the ones we are highlighting today, and be able to unearth those and highlight them, but also having champions, those who believe, like Rabbi here, people like Loreto or Vinu, people of faith that are champions. So there's peer learning. They're the people that are respected and have positive beliefs about child's participation. It's another way.
Great. So I do have a question for, let's see, the Rabbi, unless any of the others have a response to that question about unlearning and relearning.
Creo que estamos en una transición de entender el concepto de nuestra experiencia religiosa no como algo vertical, como era el modelo histórico, sino como algo más horizontal, ¿no? Y creo que ese es un aprendizaje muy difícil, muy complicado, que se tiene que dar en todo nivel, es decir, desde el marco comunitario religioso al marco hogareño. Creo que ese es el primer paso para establecer una dinámica diferente en nuestra relación con niños, niñas y adolescentes. E insisto, es muy difícil porque históricamente la autoridad se imponía de manera vertical, no había lugar para el cuestionamiento, no había lugar para las preguntas, la respuesta era porque sí o porque Dios lo dijo o algo similar. Creo que estos tiempos nos invitan a establecer una dinámica diferente para escuchar el cuestionamiento, para escuchar las preguntas, para que los niños, las niñas sean visibles en ese diálogo, pero para nosotros es un aprendizaje porque no es el modelo que conocimos. Y creo que en esa transición estamos, y este tipo de espacios y de iniciativas creo que nos ayudan a reflexionar sobre esta nueva dinámica que tenemos que ir construyendo.
Great, thank you. And I also have a question for Miss Jara. Let's see, how are the children involved in communal religious activities within the Baha'i community? Silvia, would you mind translating this?
Sorry, can you say it again, Stacy?
How are children involved in communal religious activities within the Baha'i community?
Profesora Jara, una pregunta para usted. La pregunta es cómo los niños de la comunidad Bahá'í se involucran en actividades grupales o conjuntas en la fe Bahá'í, ¿no? Según la fe Bahá'í.
Sí, gracias. Si bien dentro de la comunidad Bahá'í hay actividades que son para niños, para prejóvenes, jóvenes, estas actividades son abiertas para todos los niños jóvenes, prejóvenes, sean o no sean Bahá'ís. No son de exclusividad, solamente dentro de la comunidad. Casi todas las actividades que tenemos en la fe son abiertas a la comunidad, a los barrios, a la sociedad. Yo creo que los niños, hay muchas instancias en que los niños participan activamente con los padres. Cuando se estaba hablando de esto intergeneracional, realmente que no es algo muy natural, no es algo forzado, sino que en todas las instancias está presente familias, niños, adultos, jóvenes, prejóvenes, no hay esa distinción. Hay sí actividades como el programa de educación que va dirigido para niños de acuerdo a la edad que tengan. Algo interesante que estaba hablando recién, esta parte, esta transición que estamos viviendo, es muy importante entender que tenemos que tener claro qué tipo de sociedad queremos construir. Estamos claros que hay algo que ya terminó su tiempo, ahí tenemos que abordar las cosas de diferentes maneras, pero en base a eso, ¿qué sociedad, qué humanidad queremos tener? ¿Qué mundo queremos tener? Entonces yo creo que es importante también ir colocando las bases para ese mundo que anhelamos, que soñamos tener.
Great, thank you. And one final question, and this can be anyone. How can we avoid simply using tokenism instead of genuine participation of children? So for example, when we use children or showcase them and but don't really allow them to make decisions. And I also have, sorry, I might add one more. And what Reverend Fred was saying, he mentioned the disconnect between orthodoxy and practice. What sort of challenges, if any, have the speakers faced in advocating for or practically implementing child participation in communities, and how have you overcome these challenges? So these are slightly related. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to. I think
Stacy, can
Dr. Vina?
After Fred.
Okay.
I think it's a reality in a number of areas, not only with children's participation, that sometimes we know what is right, but doing it becomes a challenge. And for me is showcasing good practices, as Vino said earlier on, so that people change by seeing, and it means that we must be intentional. It will not just come by itself because of the nature and the structures of our society does not allow that to some extent. So we must be intentional to create some of those good practices and those spaces, and also bring in the champions, as I said before. But there are silent texts. There are some people that don't just have the handle, and we have to give them the handle. We have to give them the tools, and we have to help them to be able to interpret those silent texts to the reality on the place of children. And then lastly, it's also being deliberate in providing children's-led initiatives. Like right now, Arigatou International has come up with what we're calling Children's Solutions Lab, where children are going to come up with initiatives and ideas. They have to be children-led and children thought through. And then later on, we support for children to implement them. We must be intentional about it.
Great, and over to Vinu.
Yeah, Stacy, that's one of my, always my areas of concern. From the UN to the local community, tokenism happens all the time. But I will not point to the problem. Maybe in this seminar today, I'd like people to scratch the surface. Why do we end up with tokenism? That's a question that I want to leave you with. And if each of us in our own, all our institutions have tokenism, Rabbi Gustavo said, it's a new way of working, the horizontal way of working. We're used to verticals. So if you ask the question why, then you might start finding the answers, and then you might start discovering solutions. So sometimes it's because you want a perfect picture. Sometimes you just want, that sweet voice of a child, not the opinion of a child, but just the presence of a child. So on tokenism, I have very strong opinions, and the ground rule at Shanti Ashram is two ways in which we have prevented tokenism. One is the children come from the communities of children who participate in our work. So there is the principle of representation. They come in turns, they come in cycles, and they represent. Once they represent, the child goes back to do something in the community. That's one practical way. The second thing is the adults, I always tell them, why do you want this child? And that will take them beyond the picture, beyond the voice, beyond the presence. So that's on tokenism. But if there is one takeaway this evening, let us all work in making these horizontal and vertical collaborations meaningful and not tokenistic. One more thing I think that Fred spoke about, of lifting silent text. Now, lifting is also as powerful as the interpreter. Fred spoke about champions. I think the interpreters of our texts We have to find more and more and more positive interpreters of our text that can lead to this